Oh yeah, it's still recording. What do we got here? Yeah, we still got some time here. Okay. So we had a little interruption, some people coming by. One person, wanted, said he didn't understand the sign. Unitarian Universalist perversion of justice sucks, U*. So I explained it to her briefly, but it's kind of interesting because yes, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm protesting and doing something that's perfectly legal, I have a Charter of Rights, guaranteed right to protest. I'm protesting in a very peaceful and legal manner. I'm not doing anything illegal to the best of my knowledge. I'm not making a lot of noise and so on. And yet, a member of this church or someone attending this church threatens to call the police and maybe actually does call the police. Well, that's an abusive misuse of the police and potentially the criminal justice system if it goes further to suppress perfectly legitimate peaceful public protest. So that's just one small example of how Unitarian Universalists pervert justice. And believe me, I've had many interactions with SPVM police officers as a result of, bullshit complaints to the police. This woman walks behind me. I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to her. Didn't even necessarily know she was there or with a baby, and she accuses me of swearing because I talk about bullshit complaints to the police. Well, excuse me, but bullshit's the correct term to describe it. Yes, I could perhaps use other terms like misleading or false or so on, but bullshit is bullshit is bullshit. Montreal Unitarians have called in all kinds of bullshit complaints to the police. I don't mind using the word bullshit when Unitarian Universalist ministers are allowed to say much worse things with complete impunity by the Unitarian Universalist Association and the individual Unitarian Universalist churches they belong to. I've been called all kinds of nasty things by Unitarian Universalist ministers, both locally in terms of Unitarian Church of Montreal and also on the internet by Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein and others. So yeah, let's stick to the freedom of speech issue here. Let's bring this back to the Gadfly Papers by Reverend Todd Eckloff. During the 2019 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, one Reverend Todd Eckloff, who was and still is, for the time being anyway, the minister of the Spokane, Washington Unitarian Universalist Church, which was hosting the UUAGA in Spokane, Washington. He was distributing a book called The Gadfly Papers at a booth at the GA, General Assembly, the annual general meeting of the Unitarian Universalist Association. A big event spread over a few days where thousands of Unitarian Universalists get together to vote on things for the year and so on. Big convention of Unitarian Universalists, as it were. And apparently a certain number of people were offended by what Reverend Todd Eckloff was saying in the Gadfly Papers. Interestingly enough, he was actually speaking about freedom of speech issues, freedom of conscience issues. He was essentially saying that the current Unitarian Universalist religious community has a bit of a problem in that at least a segment of it is pretty much anti-free speech, basically censoring and suppressing and extremely political correct and so on and so forth. And he's right. He's absolutely right. That there's definite undue censorship and suppression of freedom of speech within the Unitarian Universalist religious community. And most ironically, he was censored and even censored himself. Basically, he was asked to leave and asked to stop distributing the book and this and that. And then the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, I guess a couple of months later, wrote this letter of censure. I think it was on August 19th. They published this letter of censure of Reverend Todd Eckloff, signed by 300 Unitarian Universalist ministers, i.e. not signed by 1,200 or so other Unitarian Universalist ministers. So basically signed by, 300, that's still plenty, but a minority of Unitarian Universalist ministers. Perhaps, what percentage is that? 300 versus 1,200. yeah, 20%, shall we say. So anyhow, my math is, math is not my forte, but we're talking about a nonetheless significant number. 300 is a significant number. Quite a lot of Unitarian Universalist ministers, just as 400 is a significant number when you're talking about 400 minimum Unitarian Universalist congregations affected by clergy sexual abuse of one kind or another, but probably more like 2/3 of them, let's say 600 or 700 out of 1,000. Probably all of them, if you start nitpicking about low-end sexual misconduct that wasn't necessarily reported, but a minimum of 400 Unitarian Universalist churches where actual complaints about clergy sexual misconduct were brought against one or more Unitarian Universalist ministers. Anyway, getting back to Reverend Todd Eckloff and the Gadfly Papers, what's interesting is one of the issues that he was speaking about was censorship and suppression of freedom of speech within the Unitarian Universalist religious community by, some of the more extreme elements, shall we say. Although, quite frankly, in my experience, they're not even that extreme. Basically, there's a lot of attempts to censor and suppress and silence people. And it's not just by the far left extremists, it's even by fairly conservative Unitarian Universalists, but that's another story. Anyhow, it's just ironic that as a result of this distributing this book about, amongst other things, censorship and suppression of freedom of speech, he's actually censored and suppressed and even censured, basically told he's a bad boy by the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association. Very ironic. So that was a bit of a fiasco during the 29 UUAJ back in June, and it's still ongoing. It's still a controversy surrounding that. So let's see here, we got somebody pulling up. So I made room for cars to park, and there's a guy pulled up, and looks like he's on his way into the church here. Good day, sir. You sure you're not too far away from the curb? You might get a ticket.
I hope I'm okay.
You're probably on the outer limits of being okay. You guys parked about 1.5 feet away from the curb. So anyhow, let's see if this camera's still running. And it is, and there's about 5 minutes of recording time left. So we've had a pretty successful protest here today. No sign of the police yet. I suspect this woman probably did call the police, as she threatened to do. And I suspect what happened is the police asked her, well, what's happening? What's he doing? And she probably said, oh, he's standing outside in front of the church with a picket sign talking to a camera or something like that. I mean, she could have brought a false complaint against me. It's not, Unitarians have lied about my behavior, but assuming she told the truth, she would have told them, well, there's this guy with picket signs and he's talking, blah, blah, blah. And they probably would have said, well, he's allowed to do that. He's allowed, that's called peaceful public protest, and don't really expect us to come and do anything unless he's doing something that's actually illegal. So I suspect that that's what happened when she called the police, although they may show up. It's entirely possible that she lied to them and said I assaulted her or something. It's happened in the past. I've actually had that happen on 2 different occasions where I've been falsely accused of assaulting a Unitarian Universalist woman, specifically a Montreal Unitarian Universalist woman, and even more specifically, in both instances, although I'm not sure about the first one, but the second one I'm quite sure about, I was basically falsely accused of assaulting Margot Ellis, former president of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, by Margot Ellis herself and or an accomplice. Now, that's a whole other story, but if you search Margot Ellis, Unitarian, on YouTube or in Google, you'll find my blog post about that incident, where I was essentially falsely accused of assaulting Margot Ellis or another Montreal Unitarian woman when I'd done nothing of the sort. And in fact, the second time I was accused of assaulting woman, that was like about an hour after Margot Ellis had assaulted me with a full-on body check that knocked me completely off my feet on my back in the snow on, I believe, the 4th of January of 2014. So basically, Margot Ellis saw me protesting. I stepped away from the sidewalk, giving her plenty of room to walk past me, but no, she barged into me, gave me this big elbow, knocked me right off my feet. I fell on my back in the snow. And so, we had a little discussion about that. I think I called her a bitch, excuse me, but when you do something like that, that's sort of an automatic response. I don't throw that word around often. I don't throw it lightly. But when a bitch knocks me off my feet, being a bitch, I might call her a bitch. Like I said, I generally speaking don't throw that word around. I generally speaking have a high level of respect for women, but a bitch is a bitch is a bitch, and Margot Ellis is a bitch, excuse me. So there's a few other women I could use that word to describe them, and not the least of them being Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, who is a massive bitch. You don't mind my saying so. Yeah, and there's a few others I could name, but I won't. But I'm sure they know who they are. Let's see, where are we here? Got a little distracted. Yes, okay, so yeah, we were talking about false calls to the police. I got about a minute and a half left. So we'll wrap this up. I think we might even wrap the whole protest up. Not quite sure what time it is. Let's have a look here. 10:46. Oh, we might stay for another half hour. So that's it. I think we're just wrapping this up. But yeah, Unitarian Universalist perversion of justice, plenty of it, including what I just spoke about, falsely accusing me of assault on 2 different occasions by a Montreal Unitarian woman, or even more than one Montreal Unitarian woman, because in the second instance, the police claimed to have eyewitnesses to my assault on an unidentified Unitarian Universalist woman, which means that there's at least 2 people involved in that false report, not just one. They're claiming to have eyewitnesses of an assault on a woman, while there's the alleged victim, and then there's this, claimed eyewitness, which basically could not possibly exist because there was no assault whatsoever. Let's see where we are. Oh yeah, we're